When we first meet Sid in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, he gives us his adventurous takeoff on the Gongaga runway before flying us to Cosmo Canyon. But is it actually possible? Can the Tiny Bronco actually take off from this runway with everyone on board and then fly? We're going to break it down using 3D models, math, and aerodynamic principles to render a verdict as to whether the scene is confirmed, plausible, or a total crash and burn. To arrive at a conclusion, we first need to determine how fast we need to be going to generate enough lift from our wings to get us off the ground, and then determine if we have enough engine power to get us to that speed. Finally, we need to determine if we have enough runway so that we actually fly instead of crash into the wall. So please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for takeoff. First, we need to understand a little bit about the basics of flight. In order to take off, the Tiny Bronco, or any airplane for that matter, needs to generate enough upward force, known as lift, to counteract the force of gravity, trying to keep it on the ground. The amount of force needed is proportional to the aircraft's weight. The heavier the plane, the more force you need. Mathematically, this relationship is given by the following equation, where lift is 1/2 the density of air times the velocity squared, which in our case will be the takeoff velocity, times the coefficient of lift, which is the number that tells us how good our wings are at generating lift, times the wing area. Since we want v takeoff, we're going to rearrange the equation to look like this. There have been obvious changes to the Tiny Bronco's model since the original game, and therefore it's not clear to me if we can simply reuse the weight from the original game's source material. We'll set up 3 scenarios to make sure we've got all our bases covered. The first, assuming the version we see in Rebirth weighs the same as the original game with a gross weight of 3,850 kilograms. The second, representing an estimate at the weight accounting for the Rebirth redesign at 6,000 kilograms. And a third, representing a worst-case scenario using the weight of a comparable real-world aircraft such as the V-22 Osprey at 18,000 kilograms. Notice that we're using the gross weight here so that the weight of all the passengers is already built in to the final calculation. Here you can see the amount of lift we need to generate in each scenario. That leaves us needing to solve for the coefficient of lift and the wing area. With the PC release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, we're finally able to get a good look at the 3D models used in the game. This means we can use them to determine the area of the wings. Here, I've loaded the Tiny Bronco into a 3D modeling program and isolated the wing section. We divide the wing out into 3 trapezoidal sections plus the wing flaps behind section 2, dimension everything out, and then multiply by 2 to account for the area of the full wing and not just the half wing that we were looking at. This gets us a total area of 90.6 square meters for the main wing, plus another 33.6 square meters for the flaps. The remaining question is then, what is our lift coefficient? For this analysis, I used 1.5 for the static wing and 2.5 for the flaps section based on my research for common coefficients for wings and flaps. This gives us an overall effective surface area, which will be the lift coefficient times the wing area of 220 square meters. Plugging our values into our original equation, our takeoff velocity comes out to be 37 miles per hour in our lightest scenario, 47 miles per hour in the middle scenario, and 81 miles per hour in the heaviest case. The first 2 speeds seem fairly reasonable, but the third one might be a little bit of a stretch. So the question is, can we actually reach those speeds? For that, we need to evaluate our engines. Tiny Bronco has 3 engines, 2 turboprops mounted starboard and port, right and left, and a pusher prop mounted in the center rear of the aircraft. These engines need to provide enough force, known as thrust, to overcome the drag from air resistance and friction from the landing gear on the runway to accelerate the mass of the plane down the runway to reach takeoff velocity. We'll talk about vertical takeoff in our next video, but for now, all the forces are acting horizontally. This is a classic case of force equals mass times acceleration. We know the mass, but what about the acceleration? In this scene, we see Sid take about 6.4 seconds from the time he starts his roll to the time he actually takes off. If we take the middle scenario, where the takeoff speed is 47 miles an hour, that's a constant acceleration of 7.3 miles per hour every second. Estimating the forces of friction and air resistance, which I'll leave in the description, we end up needing a thrust of 24,490 newtons, or 5,505 pounds. So, what can our engines actually provide? To get an estimate, we use the power-thrust relationship that says the power is proportional to the thrust times the velocity. According to the source material, the engines are rated at 3,800 horsepower for takeoff. I'm going to take that at face value and assume it's the same engine for all three propellers. That converts to about 8.5 million watts. But since not even SID's engines are perfectly efficient, we'll say we have 6.8 million available. Plugging our velocity and power numbers in, we see that our three engines are generating 326,000 newtons, or 73,000 pounds of thrust at takeoff speed, which is an order of magnitude greater than the thrust we actually need. To put this in perspective, that's a bit more than the combined thrust from both engines on a 737. With this information, we can also calculate how long the runway needs to be. At a constant acceleration over 6.4 seconds, we're going to need runways of 54 meters in the original case, 67 meters in the Rebirth case, and 116 meters in the worst case Osprey scenario in order to make this takeoff successfully. We can check the length of the runway in-game by standing at one end of the runway and placing a marker on the other. When we do that, we find that the runway is exactly 200 meters, giving us the all-clear for takeoff. With a reasonably achievable takeoff speed, thanks to some rather overpowered engines and more than enough runway for something even as heavy as an Osprey to take off, it appears that the Tiny Bronco can in fact make this takeoff without issue. Using slightly less colorful language, we'll just call this 100% confirmed. Before we leave this analysis, let's check one final specification of the Tiny Bronco, its top speed, which the source material tells us is 235 knots, or roughly 270 miles per hour. Given everything we know and have calculated, what do we get for a theoretical top speed? At high speeds, the available engine power is spent overcoming the aerodynamic drag. In steady, level flight, the power available, after accounting for propulsive efficiency, must offset this drag given by the following equation. In this case, the area is not just the surface area of the wings, but also the fuselage, which we know because we have the 3D model. I'll leave the detailed equations in the description for those that are interested, but in the end, we get a theoretical top speed of 226 knots, or 260 miles per hour. That's within 5% of the canonical top speed of the Tiny Bronco, and unlike the takeoff speed, this top speed is not dependent on how heavy we assume the Bronco to be. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the analysis, and we'll see you next time as we examine the vertical takeoff in Rebirth's final scene.
Happy trails to you!